I'd like to know how many of you have ever woken up unable to move or cry out, can't move a bit, can't say anything. Or sometimes it might happen just as you're about to fall asleep, but you're awake and you can't move.
Well, Dr. Hufford, it's a pleasure to interview you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's good to have you here.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you've done, and feel free to include whatever it represents to you, and maybe some of the little tags and names of where you've done it.
Okay. Well, beginning in college and graduate school in the 1960s, I was very interested in belief, people's beliefs. And I was particularly interested in the beliefs of ordinary people, especially the ones that were treated as nonsense by the academic world. Superstition, folk belief, popular belief, that sort of thing. And actually, the academic world treats spiritual belief in general that way. I was interested in alternative medicine, too, at the same time, for the same reason, although there wasn't a name for it then. Didn't have any name for it other than quackery, probably, is what people called it. And I was, right from the beginning, I was convinced that ordinary people are smarter, are more sensible than they're given credit for by scholars, and that traditions that are widespread and deeply held probably have more rational basis and more observation built into them than the theories that I was taught in graduate school. Not by any means all. Certainly there are lots of traditions that have serious logical and other errors in them, but I couldn't believe that all of the beliefs of ordinary people that are not part of the academic worldview were therefore nonsense. In fact, I had the impression that the academic worldview might be just a little too narrow, and that regular people might have something to offer about it through their experience and what they believed about things. So I began my fieldwork in Newfoundland, Canada, which is an isolated, remote place that I thought would be a good place to find antique beliefs, old-fashioned beliefs. It was a good place for that. And I started looking for beliefs there that I thought that claimed to have an experiential basis, and that would then allow me to evaluate, well, how well does this tradition reflect observations that one could actually pursue on a research basis? And that was where I initially ran into sleep paralysis. That's not quite true. I ran into sleep paralysis 6 years earlier when it happened to me, and I didn't tell anybody about it. Then in Newfoundland, I ran into a tradition about sleep paralysis. This is what Newfoundlanders called the old hag. They believed it was caused either by witchcraft or by ghosts. And I didn't know it was sleep paralysis at the beginning there either. It took me about a year of working back and forth between the tradition and the scientific literature to identify it as what sleep researchers call sleep paralysis. And the description of sleep paralysis in the literature at that time was very narrow, I would say impoverished. It didn't include any of the interesting details that I came to realize are actually inherent in it, no matter where you find it. So that was Newfoundland. I was beginning to see, yes, there are beliefs that are based on experience that have been dismissed as superstitious beliefs that bear much more investigation. I returned from Newfoundland in 1974 as I finished my doctoral degree, took up a position on the faculty at Penn State's Medical School in behavioral science.
Could I ask you, how did you get to Newfoundland? Were you positioned there in a university, or were you just doing research?
I went to Newfoundland to do my dissertation, but in order to pay for, put food on the table, I had a family, and I myself had to eat. So wasn't able to get any sort of external support for it. So I took a position at the Memorial University of Newfoundland in St. John's, Newfoundland, in the folklore department. and they have an archive there. So I worked in the archive, and I was able to use materials that had already been collected by others to fill in what I was seeing in my interviews. And it was actually in the archive that I first came across this thing that they called the old hag, and that then I quickly did surveys and my own interviews on. So I was teaching and doing my doctoral field work in Newfoundland. Then I came back to the US, took the position in behavioral science at the medical school at Penn State, and continued to pursue this interest in, I'll say, contested beliefs, because it includes medical beliefs that are outside of conventional medicine, everything from acupuncture to herbalism, etc.
How did you perceive contested beliefs to, what would you have called them? I mean, society would call them contested or dubious, and you would have called them...
I think contested is fine, because contested doesn't indicate that they are wrong, only that there's a debate about them. And I called them unconventional, and that was unconventional from the academic point of view. So unconventional medicine, unconventional spiritual belief. I didn't use terms, and I despise terms like superstition and stigmatizing terms that just refer to other people's beliefs that you don't like in a negative way. So I pursued that really through the rest of my career. I just retired last year after 33 years at the medical school, and I spent all of my time working on this experience, belief, connection. Why would you do that in a medical school? Well, because all of the beliefs that I was interested in bear on diagnosis and doctor-patient relationship. Some of them are health beliefs, so they're people's beliefs in, spiritual healing. I did a lot of field work at religious healing shrines in Canada, but also herbalism, all kinds of health beliefs. But then the spiritual experiences, the ones that interest me most. So that includes sleep paralysis with a frightening presence. It includes near-death experiences. It includes bereaved people having the experience of being visited by a deceased loved one. These are all experiences that are built into spiritual traditions all over the world, and that in the Western modern world for at least the past 100 years have been explained on the basis of psychopathology. So the discovery that those experiences are common, that they occur among normal people, that they are not in fact indicative of any kind of disease, has tremendous importance for medicine. The change in diagnosis that it should make would be to, I think, perhaps dramatically reduce the rate at which people are incorrectly diagnosed as having not just psychological problems, but major psychotic problems. A colleague of mine, a psychiatrist, also interested in sleep paralysis, did a survey of professional psychiatrists, giving them a description of a perfectly typical sleep paralysis episode with the frightening presence, etc., and asked people what they made of it. Over half of them diagnosed it as a psychotic episode. Most of them thought the person was schizophrenic. That's appalling. One of the big questions about experiences like these is, why are they so little known? The reason that improper theories, such as the psychopathology theories, have been able to be applied to these experiences and beliefs is that they were thought to be very rare. How could they be thought to be very rare when they're actually very, very common? They're thought to be very rare because they're rarely admitted to. They're rarely reported. Why is that? It's because people don't want to be thought insane. When I interview people about these experiences, they often tell me that I'm the first person they've told. I say, well, why didn't you tell anyone? They all say the same thing. I didn't want people to think I was crazy. One of the most fascinating social issues here is that all of these kinds of experience were well known in Western tradition up to 300 or 400 years ago. It's not simply that Western culture never had a clue about these things. It's even more dramatic. We erased it. We erased knowledge of these experiences from the cultural repertoire while the experiences were continuing to happen. That is dramatic. That's a level of social control that's very impressive.
What kind of actions did we do?
In order to accomplish that?
To erase.
Well, first of all, scholars, academics, elite intellectuals in general, constantly describing these things as, if not indicative of insanity, then being primitive, being a product of lack of education, naivety. And in fact, anthropology, for example, contributes enormously to this by locating beliefs and experiences of the kind that we're talking about being prevalent right through the mainstream of modern society as being characteristic of less developed traditional cultures around the world. Historians contribute to it too, because people are constantly describing the advent of modernity as being in part an end to those kinds of naive views about the world, which are always taken, both in the anthropological record and the historical record, to be products of the imagination acting on a combination of ignorance and cultural input, never realizing the extent to which they're based not just on experience, but experience that is not limited to the culture or the historical period that's being looked at. So that's part of it. They're cast as naive, indicative of a lack of education, lack of awareness, presence within modern Western society. Nobody likes to be thought of as naive and credulous and uneducated. So that's a stigma. But then when you get into the 20th century and psychiatry becomes a powerful force and psychopathology becomes an official label which can cost you a great deal if it's applied to you. It was very bad to be diagnosed as psychotic. And that in itself is unfortunate, the stigma that Western society places on mental illness. But that being said, that being the case, the assumption and the constant reiteration of the claim that these kinds of experiences, seeing things that people ought not to be able to see, hearing things that they shouldn't hear. We say things, you're hearing things. Well, everybody's hearing things, you know. By hearing things, we mean, and you're hearing things that aren't there, and you're seeing things too. And that is sort of the cardinal feature of being crazy. So you add craziness to primitive, uneducated, naive, credulous. You've got all the stigma that you need to make people not want to admit to these experiences unless they're in a cultural frame that somehow makes it permissible. And then they only speak to each other. Or if they speak to the larger society, they're people who don't care what other people think of them, which means, by definition, that they're not in the mainstream. And then, of course, you see these reports cropping up in marginalized groups, and it reinforces, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, it reinforces the idea that these are products of failure to assimilate into modern, well-educated, sophisticated life. If they're identifiable marginalized groups who are willing to talk about these things, then they have a cultural frame that makes it possible for them to do it, which, in the sense of being right on, complicates the issue. They're going to have their own sort of nuances and wrinkles on the interpretation that are specific to their point of view. We don't have to say, and they're wrong, but we can say if you look at 6 different groups, and they may be right on in their description of the experience, but their interpretations of its meaning may conflict with each other. At the end of the day, you might at least be able to say, well, they can't all be right about the meaning of it. So let me give you some examples, and I don't mean to stigmatize any group by saying they're marginalized. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who we usually call Mormons. It's no surprise if you look at the recent Republican race for the candidacy for president, Mitt Romney had problems with the mainstream religious population because people are not quite sure about LDS folks. I have a lot of LDS friends, and I think very highly of the LDS community, but they're not sort of mainstream Christianity. Well, one of the things that's different about LDS, and has been true from their beginning in the middle of the 19th century, is that they have very strong beliefs about the reality of spiritual experience and a variety of spiritual experiences. And they're open talking with each other about them. So I found, when I started looking in North America for traditions about sleep paralysis, one place I found them, and I've documented them in publications, it was among Mormons. Now, they didn't tell them freely to non-Mormons. I mean, that discourse is sort of within the community, naturally enough. But that's one place where stories of Mormons, particularly in the mission field, being attacked by demonic forces that would paralyze them and press on them and terrify them, which they then would overcome using a priestly blessing that is known within the Mormon Church. So it sort of fits with into the Mormon worldview. Among Jehovah's Witnesses, another group that I have a lot of respect for, but which is certainly not part of the mainstream Christian religious part of our society. I have seen, it's not so much that I've heard this from witnesses, but I've seen in witness publications numerous references to sleep paralysis, all explained on the basis of the people who had the paralysis having somehow allowed into their house things that were associated with what the witnesses would call pagan religious practice. So it's a different interpretation, similar to the Mormon interpretation in that it's real and it's bad. These are bad things happening to you. They're real spiritual bad things happening to you. And the description of the experiences are the same, but the interpretation is a bit different. I just recently discovered that among Hare Krishna members in the northeastern United States, sleep paralysis is well known and discussed. And that actually within that community they have their own name for it called the clamp, which refers to that feeling of being clamped, held tight. So that's another group. Any others don't spring to mind immediately. Newfoundlanders, of course, are a social group that's geographically marginalized and also culturally marginalized within Canada in a lot of ways. And you find the tradition there, you don't find it on the mainland. I mean, there probably are pockets in mainland Canada, but it's really there in Newfoundland that it's well known. And their description of it, I mean, they too, they interpret it somewhat differently from, well, certainly differently from the way the witnesses interpret it, but they interpret it as a real spiritual experience and a bad thing being done to you. Yeah. Well, I use the term old hag only because I started the work in Newfoundland and I began the story of the research in Newfoundland. And it's an unfortunate term. I mean, actually in Newfoundland it doesn't have a feminine referent anyway. It refers to the experience, but it's applied because it's an old English term for witch, and it is feminine in that sense. I would try to avoid that. I mean, I wouldn't not tell people that's what they call it in Newfoundland, but I would choose some other term as the central term. What I use often in my classes now is Mara, which is the Swedish term for it, M-A-R-A, which comes from the same Anglo-Saxon root as, well, not Anglo-Saxon actually, it predates that, as M-A-R-E in nightmare comes from. And the root is the verb to crush. And so, like the nightmare is the crusher that comes in the night, in Sweden they simply call it the crusher, Mara. And I would use that because it wouldn't have any sort of connotations for most English speakers. And I do regret that term old hag having become so popular. I'd like to update the book, and someday, time permitting, I will revise it, but there's nothing that I said in the book that I've since decided was wrong. And I've never actually received any specific criticism of any point made in the book. There are some things that I only was dimly aware of at the time of the book that have become clearer to me now. I have one example in the book where, excuse me, one example in the book where a sleep paralysis episode turns into an out-of-body experience. And it's toward the end of the book, and I say I'm not sure whether this is, at all common or whether this is kind of a unique outlier. Well, within a few years of having published the book, I realized that it was actually I wouldn't say common, but not rare. Basically, it is that if sleep paralysis goes on for more than a little while, usually the episodes are fairly brief, seconds or minutes. But when an experience goes on 10, 15 minutes or longer, which they sometimes do, it becomes more and more common for them to turn into out-of-body experiences. And I know people who actually use sleep paralysis intentionally and cultivate sleep paralysis in order to use it as a path to out-of-body experiences, which is, to me, very interesting culturally, because it's something also that I had encountered in some shamanic traditions in other cultures. It's not something I recommend to people. I'd find another way to leave your body if I were you, but just because the paralysis experience is generally so negative.
Are these individuals you know personally, would they be considered acceptable individuals in today's modern, for example, American society? Would they be respectable? And
as long as they didn't talk about this to the wrong people, they would. I mean, they're just ordinary people from all walks of life, but who have, because of having had, first of all, more than one sleep paralysis experience, and in most cases, having talked with other people about their sleep paralysis, it doesn't require that cultural development to move toward the out-of-body portion of this, but it helps. People compare notes, and they begin to recognize the connection, and then work to exploit it. The person I had in the book,
the connection to out-of-body experiences,
yeah.
And they've cultivated. It's amazing.
Yeah. Now, the person in the book had an out-of-body experience on her very first sleep paralysis experience, and had not talked with other people. So those aren't necessary, but it does seem that it sort of supports that development. I mean, actually, with spiritual experiences generally, if you cannot talk about your spiritual experience to anyone else, you cannot know whether it's common or rare. If you can't look at commonalities and differences between your experiences and other experiences, you have very, very little to go on. You know, you're stuck with an isolated bit of data that seems very important, but it's hard to know what to do with it or what to make of it, which is maybe the profoundest effect of the cultural suppression of discussion and knowledge about these experiences, that it prevents people from building that knowledge into both their spiritual practice and their everyday lives. Because in modern society there is this deep ignorance that we have produced, then people's experiences do have a kind of purity, because they don't get layered on various sort of interpretations, dogmas, and meanings. People don't get told, oh, that's because you are this, that, or the other thing, and here's what you now have to do, because they're not told anything. So there is a kind of purity there. I'm not sure that it's worth the cost. It's not surprising that a person who has multiple sleep paralysis experiences with a terrifying presence and can never tell anybody about it walks around with a really big load to bear. That's really tough. But even very good experiences, near-death experiences, people often say are the most wonderful experience they ever had. And there are lots of other classes of spiritual experiences that people have without having known that such things could happen to them, and go decades often without ever telling anybody else. That's a burden, even if it's the most wonderful experience they ever had. Not to be able to ask anybody else, what do you think this means? Or to find out that thousands of other people have had the same experience and have given it thought. That's a loss. And it's a harm done to people. The big harm is to be incorrectly diagnosed. That's a very big harm. But second after that is to be silenced about these things. Not only to be silenced, but to be kept ignorant of what should be easily available additional information about them that pretty much all other cultures in the world provide to their people, and that we manage not to. That's the most important thing to find out. I mean, because otherwise your experience seems monstrous. Or if you happen to have a very strong sense of self and be really confident about your own self-worth, maybe it makes you think that you are now sort of a prophet or something. You know, maybe the problem is in the other direction. You need to know that you're not unique, both so that you don't exaggerate the meaning of it, but also so that you don't take it as a defect or a flaw. Yeah, I think that's very important. In the 1920s, there were a number of books written on out-of-body experiences that used the term astral projection, which is what psychics used to call this.
Astral travel.
Astral travel,
yeah.
right, yeah. And in those books, and I have several of them, many of them describe what they call astral catalepsy. And they are talking about sleep paralysis, and they say it's because you're partway out. You're not far enough out to know that you are having an out-of-body experience, but you're too far out to access the controls to your body anymore. So that's another cultural interpretation. Well, I am confident that sleep paralysis does not result in death. Now, I guess I should add that if a person was in very, very fragile health with a heart problem, and if you were sick enough so that watching the Super Bowl could kill you, this could kill you. and there are people with that kind of cardiac condition, you know, and anything really, really scary that gets their blood pressure up and their heart race can be bad for them. Sure, but it would be hard to say that it was sleep paralysis that killed you then. It would be your heart condition. Now, why is it that some people think that this can kill? Well, first of all, it feels like you're going to die frequently. I mean, the first time I had it, I thought I was going to die. So it feels, and if you're having trouble breathing, especially, which sometimes people do with this, you may feel that you're going to die.
No,
so that's one piece.
You felt like you were going to die.
I thought I was being killed.
By a creature?
Yeah, something that was kneeling on my chest and strangling me.
Okay, excuse my interjection, but
No, that's okay.
You know, it's hard to take I thought I was going to die with a straight face.
Well, I've had many people describe to me saying they felt that they would die, or they felt they would die if they couldn't get out of it. And in many traditions, that's also said. People in Newfoundland said that it could kill you if you didn't stop it in time. That's understandable because in tradition, because of the subjective impression that it's so overwhelming. But there are many reasons to doubt that this ever results in death. Number one is knowing how prevalent it is. We know that between 17 and 20% of the population has this at least once. A subset of that has it numerous times. Some people have it frequently. If it was killing people, that would turn up in the epidemiology of unexplained death, let's say. So, another reason that some people believe that it can result in death is the way it's been connected with something called sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, which is something that was first described in a group of Southeast Asian refugees in the United States. It came to the attention of the Centers for Disease Control that a remarkable number of previously healthy men, mostly between the ages of 30 and 40, in this particular community, this group was the Hmong, H-M-O-N-G, were dying in their sleep, and on autopsy, no cause of death could be found. Now that was very striking. First of all, well, the main thing is that in the United States, deaths in sleep are, outside of this group, always explained on autopsy. And they're almost always heart events, and some of them are stroke. But heart attacks are particularly common late in the night, early in the morning, for a variety of reasons. But you know what that is when you see it. These were unexplained, and they were previously healthy, they were young, so it just didn't make any sense. So people started studying this. Now, early on, and this happened in the 80s, people studying these deaths, talking to Hmong refugees, started to hear accounts of people waking up during the night, unable to move. Well, it turns out that, like most cultures in the world, the Hmong have a well-established tradition about what we're calling sleep paralysis. The Hmong, like most cultures around the world, have a well-established tradition about what we're calling sleep paralysis. And when they recount the experiences, they have all the same features that we find everywhere: the frightening presence, often the difficulty breathing, the paralysis, all of those things. Well, the Hmong, because they have a tradition, are willing to talk about it. So folks working with the Hmong heard about this. Now, being modern Westerners and deprived of their traditional right to knowledge of this, heard this and they thought, ooh, that's really strange. And interviewing people about it, they heard, can't move, it's during the night, sometimes people have great difficulty breathing, feel like they could die. Time to jump to a conclusion here. And they jumped to the conclusion that these were survivors of the event that in other people became sudden unexplained nocturnal death. And they explained it as what's called a culture-bound syndrome. That is a kind of sickness that is produced by something about one's culture. So there are a number of these so-called culture-bound syndromes, mostly psychiatric disorders, that are thought to be peculiar to particular cultures. And it was said by the people doing that work, and some people still say this, that because of the stress of being refugees and being in a foreign land and loss of, all kinds of things back home and all of the trauma, and these people have been through terrible traumas, that stress was producing this culturally elaborated, terrifying experience that killed people by psychological stress, that was what was causing the deaths. Well, I really don't think there's any chance that that's true. First of all, well, there are several reasons, but first of all, the distribution of the unexplained deaths is nothing like the distribution of sleep paralysis. The things that they were calling survival of sleep paralysis are indistinguishable from sleep paralysis in other settings. But we know that among women as well as among men, older and younger Hmong people, are all having sleep paralysis also. Why aren't these other people dying? And in addition to that, I won't do the whole laundry list of objections to this idea, but the other is that pattern of death has been seen in other South Asian and Western Pacific ethnic groups. It's an ethnically linked pattern of death. And among people from the Philippines who were doing migrant labor in Hawaii in the 1950s, the same discovery was made by local medical examiners. People were dying. They found that the Filipinos also had a tradition about waking up unable to move, and we're talking about it. And that was also misattributed as the cause of death in that group. The best explanation of these deaths that I've seen so far, and I think it's practically complete now, the understanding of this, it's a cardiac conduction defect that is genetically determined, that's linked to this ethnic group, and that is sensitive to dietary change, and that because of changes in diet, that susceptibility was exploited in this environment. And so they were dying of fatal arrhythmias. And an arrhythmia can kill you, but it doesn't leave any marks. It's not a heart attack. It's just the rhythm goes all haywire and stops pumping blood. That seems to be what it is. And that's why it's in this group. The epidemiology lines up. And yet, some scholars and some, I guess, psychiatrists as well as anthropologists and others just can't seem to let go of the idea of this as a culture-bound syndrome. But also, it's not culture-bound. It can only look culture-bound when you ignore its universal distribution. So that link is, I am sure, spurious. Or if there is any connection at all, it would have to be like what I said about people with very bad heart conditions. Possibly, people with that cardiac conduction problem might be more likely to have an arrhythmia if they had sleep paralysis. I don't even know that that's true. So it doesn't kill. The other connection that some people have made, and I haven't seen this in the literature, but I think it's important to dispel it as kind of a public service. I have a couple of times talked to women who had sleep paralysis within a space of months of the time that their baby died of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, and who were terrified that what had happened to them was what had killed their baby. Now, here too, not only is there no reason to believe that, there's every reason to believe it's not the case. And I'll just give you the best sort of obvious bit of evidence on that, and that is that when physicians discovered, epidemiologists, a few years ago, that if children are put to sleep on their back rather than their stomach, they almost never have SIDS if they stay on their back. Well, that's exactly the reverse of what you would get with sleep paralysis, because sleeping on your back makes sleep paralysis more likely, but it prevents SIDS. So it doesn't make any sense to connect them. I was very careful not to make any sort of extravagant interpretation about this throughout my career. I just let the data speak for itself. But what I have been able to do, and was very intent on doing as I went along, was testing all of the explanations that came forward for this and for things like this, like sleep paralysis. And all of those explanations are clearly wrong. It is not produced by cultural context. It's not only not culture bound, it is not cultural influences on sleep paralysis that put in the content. The content is there across cultures, and it's the same content among people who have never heard of anything like it before. You don't need to know about it to have the real thing. So it's not cultural. Then it's, well, what would the other conventional explanations be? There aren't any. Our explanation, and I've called this the cultural source hypothesis and broken it down into a lot of different segments, the way in which the theory is applied. All of our conventional explanations of subjectively compelling, complex, call them supernatural or spiritual or paranormal experiences, depend on cultural programming. Because we don't have any knowledge of any ordinary cause, be it an illness or a psychological state or whatever, that produces a complex, compellingly real, relatively lengthy, sequenced subjective experience. Now, there are some subjective experiences we know that do have physiological causes, but you look at them and they're all very simple. That is, they have just one or two features. So people recovering from alcohol intoxication, people who are alcoholics, they're detoxing, one of the experiences they often have is the feeling that snakes or spiders are crawling over their skin. Okay, that has a physiological cause. We know what it is. It's an aspect of the way in which detoxification produces sensations in the peripheral nervous system on the skin. And it's a sensation called formication. And it feels like something sort of walking on the underside of your skin, in fact. Well, we know what causes that. We know the mechanism of it, and we know why anyone feeling that, if they were in a situation that would produce a hallucination, would hallucinate little things crawling on their skin. Okay, but that's simple. That's one thing. That's as complex as we can get. If you look at schizophrenia, we know that schizophrenics often hear voices commenting negatively on them and their behavior. Okay, but that's relatively simple. I mean, if schizophrenics were known to have a guy in a green suit follow them around and comment on, well, only the way they cook, you know, and you found that in schizophrenics all over the world, then you'd have to say, what kind of thing is this? That would be a level of complexity that would immediately get your attention. But the complexity of hearing voices negatively commenting on your behavior, that's simple. And it's not difficult to see how that's produced by the dynamics of the psychological disorder. But in sleep paralysis, we have, what did I have in my index of features? There were over 30 individual features that recur in all different settings. They recur in the same way, in roughly the same order, always in the same general relationship to each other. We don't have any conventional explanations for an internal production of an experience of that kind. Unless you wanted to use, actually even if you wanted to use Jungian collective unconscious and archetypes, Jung never proposed that the archetypes would unfold, I'll call them sort of subjective narratives of this length and complexity. He saw the archetypes as being expressed in very different ways in different settings, with just some general similarities. So even from a Jungian point of view, which would not be a conventional point of view anyway, we don't have explanations for this. And I said I'd get in trouble for this eventually, always with audience, because after I said, well, Kip, it's not this, not this, it's not this, and everybody knows what it looks like, and they say, well then, so what is it? And I say, I don't know any explanations that fit the data, other than, of course, the traditional ones, that it's a spiritual experience.
The data says what it's not. It doesn't say what it is.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, if an alien came from another planet and landed in the yard, I mean, we might call it an alien, but there's absolutely no way that we could convince anybody that a spaceship came and landed, even if we saw it happen.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, because it's
not supposed to happen.
It's not supposed to happen, and it's somehow that follows from what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Well, part of it is there is the assumption that things like that can't happen. Or if you believe in things like that they wouldn't happen with the kind of reliable replicability. They're replicable not in the sense that we can produce them and then look at them as we produce them, but we can predict them. If we take 100 people, we know how many of those people will be able to tell us an account. If we do a prospective study, we could tell you how long it would take in a sample of 1,000 people to have one happen just tomorrow or last night. Of course, being there is almost an insuperable obstacle for research on this, because even though we're saying they're remarkably prevalent, the number of nights of sleep you would have to watch in order to catch one is high, except in those cases where they're happening very frequently. And some individuals have them very frequently, and there are some places where they happen a whole lot. And in those places, presumably, you would be able to go and sort of catch one in the sense that you would be able to observe it happening prospectively. But the design and cost issues here are so complex that people haven't tried to do that. So I said that the problem is things like this are not supposed to happen. And when people tell stories like this, it's supposed to, you follow them down, you're not supposed to get to a first-person account. Or if you get to a first-person account, you're not supposed to get a lot of other verification from other witnesses of the same kind of thing happening from many different points of view. It is anomalous, or as I like to call them, it's illegal. Because anomalous means these things don't follow rules. But actually, you look at sleep paralysis and the occurrence of the terrifying presence and what happens with the presence, it's loaded with rules. That's why we can make predictions about it. It's just that it's not following the rules that it's supposed to. It's an illegal experience.
So, I mean, that completely makes sense. What you're saying is it's an attack. We're being attacked.
Yeah.
That's undeniable.
It's an attack. And if someday, and what I'm trying to do by staying close to the data, I'm not trying to insist, well, therefore it's got to be supernatural. I'm just saying, well, if you don't like the supernatural explanation, tell me the other explanation. Or work on it until you come up with another explanation. And it's important to me to say, but don't say to the person who's had the experience and believes that it was supernatural that they're being irrational. They're not. They're being perfectly logical. And the more they know about the experience, the more logical their conclusion, When it just happens to them and they don't know it ever happened to anybody else, it's still logical for them to think that it's a supernatural sort of thing. They find out about other people having it, it becomes more logical, not less logical. Some people think that when you find out about the neurophysiology of the paralysis, because that's very well understood in both some animals, cats in particular, who have similar sleep patterns to humans, and in humans, we know the biochemistry and we know the pathways by which the paralysis was produced. So some people say, well, so that's what's producing all of this. Well, once again, we don't know any pathway that produces something like all of this. And we can say that in the sleep paralysis state, with that physiological trigger, you're in an altered state of consciousness. So far, so good, but that's as far as the conventional explanation takes you. And from the point of view of the person who says, well, I believe it was supernatural, they simply say, yeah, so I guess that's the state of consciousness in which we're able to have these perceptions. And people have always thought that altered states of consciousness were a gateway, as it were, to having paranormal, I guess, perceptions. Nothing illogical about that.
This thing can't be human.
Well, if it is a thing that is not...
It would break people's sternums.
Yeah, well, not only that, it wouldn't be able to come through walls so easily either, presumably, or float in the air. It does all kinds of things. And also, many times, what people see doesn't even look human.
So it's not human.
Right. The people in sleep paralysis are not being attacked by another physical human being.
And it's not any animal that we know.
It is definitely not any animal that we know.
And what else does it do that proves it's not human?
Well, the appearance in many cases, well, let's say not human. There's actually an issue here. You look at the Newfoundland belief that witchcraft has ways of making this happen. In Japan, there's a belief that ninjas have esoteric practices that can make this happen. In Africa, there's a belief that sorcerers can do this to other people. Those people would say it is human, but it's not the physical human. It's either some non-physical part of that person or something that they call.
It's just like a spear in the same sense as human.
Yeah, right. That would fit. That would fit. Now, again, there would be people who say, but it can't be supernatural because nothing is. I mean, that would be the main reason that it couldn't be. If nothing is, well, then it couldn't be.
How ridiculous is that statement? It can't be supernatural because nothing is. I mean, tell me about how is that ridiculous?
Well, I think that we should be careful about calling other people's faiths ridiculous. It is a statement of faith.
Fair. That's fair. You're fair. Your point, your statement is fair.
Yeah. But it is just a statement of faith when people say there is no supernatural. Many people believe there is no supernatural. The majority of Americans believe there is a supernatural reality. They differ in their beliefs about what it's like and what's in it. But anybody who holds religious or spiritual beliefs with any remote resemblance to anything traditional are holding a belief that there is a supernatural domain that has some relationship to humans.
So are you saying that people have to retreat into belief or faith in order to fight their way out of this occurrence?
You mean people who want to say it's not supernatural?
Yes.
Well, sure. And there are people who say that being scientific means adopting a naturalistic or materialistic stance. That's worked pretty well for science on the things that science has done most of its work on. I personally think that doesn't make much sense as a philosophy to be philosophically materialistic on these things. It's more of a methodological thing. Because if you're going to say, I am sure that the following things don't exist and don't happen, you're going to have a heck of a time adducing evidence for it. You're really going to be describing something that is directly analogous to a sort of religious dogmatic point of view. And if you ask a skeptic why they hold that view, they're going to tell you that when you look at the things that people believe about the supernatural, you always find on close inspection that there are better There are better naturalistic explanations for them. It's a product of misunderstanding. Well, they're not looking at things like what we're talking about. In fact, what they're usually looking at is experience and practice within a religious framework that has institutional sort of routines set up, and where, particularly in modern religion, there isn't very much to experimentally or observationally verify or otherwise. And what we're talking about, not just with sleep paralysis, but near-death experiences, the bereavement experiences, and some others that we could list, are spontaneous experiences that occur in all sorts of contexts all over the world that do have local cultural developments about them, but where you don't have to buy any of the local cultural accounts in order to say this looks like a real experience in which people are having perceptions of a non-material reality. And if you want to say, even though it looks like that, and I can't imagine where that appearance comes from in any conventional way, you still have to say, that is what it looks like. For a lot of people, identifying something as supernatural is done by saying there's no scientific explanation for this. So it's a residual category. It's the things that science can't explain that become supernatural. Well, we're not saying that. When you talk about sleep paralysis with this presence seeming like a supernatural event, we're talking about positive identification of the characteristics people have always identified with spirit things. Comes through the wall, floats in the air. You can sense things about it. It does things to you in weird, spooky ways. Einstein used the term spooky force, or spooky action at a distance, to describe what he didn't like about Newton's theory of gravity and some of the aspects of quantum theory. And scientists often talk about spooky forces and how you want to make sure you don't start putting spooky forces into your theories. And that's a central characteristic of the modern attitude. And these experiences look like they include exactly what you would call a spooky force, a non-physical reality.
That, approximately or exactly, that have experienced, that have been attacked?
Yeah. I can't tell you how many I've interviewed because I forgot to keep count starting about 20 years ago. It's definitely over 1,000. I don't know how many it would be. It's many, many, many people, both interviewed and then also survey responses. And, and then also, of course, I've got a large number of accounts from print, which are really interesting because usually the people who are putting them in print don't recognize them, don't know what they are, but you can see them. If you know sleep paralysis, you can look at it and say, there's another one.
It's like faces jumping out of a painting.
Well, it is, yeah. Yeah, although those are usually ambiguity being exploited by our tendency to impose pattern, like as we do with ink blots. Excuse me. These are different from ink blots in that you can say in advance, here are the criteria. In fact, I could tell somebody else who had never had or heard of sleep paralysis, I could say, here are the criteria, go look through these texts and see whether you see them or not. And anybody who read carefully would see all the same ones. I mean, I make that point because I don't want the listener to imagine that we're talking about ambiguous accounts of experience in which a person who is attuned to sleep paralysis can sort of project sleep paralysis into them. It's not like that.
You separate all the confusing stuff out and end up with basic criteria.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the vernacular, in other words, in everyday life, if you had a picture of this creature that does the attacking,
Yeah.
what would people say it was?
You mean what would they say it looks like?
Yes, but
Okay.
no, not what would they compare it to and say it's closely, it's
Yeah.
what would they say that's a drawing? Hey, here's I do this drawing, what is that?
Yeah, right.
What would they say it is?
Okay. Well, we've talked about this a little bit before. Within these patterns, we have constrained variation, but we don't have identity from instance to instance. So there are a bunch of things that people do not ever describe, but here is the range of the most common descriptions. First of all, humanoid, usually. Not always, but looking generally like a human figure, usually dark. A lot of people have told me that they started calling it the shadow man to themselves. It's not always male, but it frequently is male. Shadow man is a common sort of spontaneous label that people put on it. It's usually sort of normal human size. Sometimes it's smaller, and sometimes it's quite large, 7 feet or taller, but never gigantic. Sometimes it is more like a cloud or a mass of some sort, like a cloud or vapor coming toward you and then surrounding you. A number of people describe that. That's less common than the humanoid form. And fairly often people describe a presence that they can't see, but that they are aware of, both where it is, where it's moving, what it wants, that sort of thing, what it intends to do, that it intends to hurt them, or some people often say they're sure that it wants to kill them. So those
I'm
are...
trying to get you to say monster, but I'm failing.
Oh, monster. Yeah, well, the reason I wouldn't say it looks
I
like
know,
a
I'm
monster,
sure, yeah.
is that monster to us typically means something more physical.
Yeah, and it's too
Yeah,
ambiguous too, I think.
Yeah.
A person can be a monster in a Star
Yeah,
Wars,
right.
so.
Yeah.
But if someone saw a drawing of it, they'd say, they might say, "Are you drawing a monster?" But I
They
like
might,
your
yeah.
I like your specifics much better.
Okay,
Much better.
good.
Than what I was
Yeah.
thinking.
I mean, names that people would more easily put to them would be demon or ghost. Those are two things that people frequently say.
What it does,
Sure.
or explain your experience of it, whatever you think would best
Yeah.
be poignant for someone who hasn't had this, and for someone who needs to know that they have had this and someone else has.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you both a very spare and then a somewhat more detailed description. If you find yourself awake and you can't move, and there seems to be, well, if that happens, you're having sleep paralysis. Unless later you wake up and you realize it was a dream, because when people come out of sleep paralysis, they can tell the difference between that and a dream. So you're aware of your environment. Usually you can see it. Sometimes people say they can't open their eyes, but usually they say they see the environment. That's sleep paralysis. Most of the time, 80% or more of the time when that happens, people will also feel or see a frightening presence in the room with them. If that happens, then you're off on the typical sleep paralysis experience. And then it ends when you can move, and when you can move, the movement comes back all at once. It's very, very rare for it to be at all gradual. Usually you just go from total immobility to easy movement. And you're lucid through the whole thing. You are wide awake, and when it ends, you remember it perfectly clearly, not like a dream. You just feel that all that happened was you moved, and when you move, the thing is gone. That's a spare description. Now, I'll give you, there are lots of other features that frequently come into this. I will describe to you the first time it happened to me, which was before I'd ever heard about it from anybody else. I was a sophomore in college. I'd gone to bed early. It was after my last final exam in the fall semester. I was very tired. Being sleepy, sleep deprived, which I was, makes this more likely. So I was primed for this because I'd missed a lot of sleep preparing for exams. So I went to bed early. I woke up hearing the door of my apartment open. And I thought, it's probably somebody coming to see if I want to go to dinner because I'd gone to bed so early. And I heard footsteps coming across the room. And then I found I couldn't move. And that was very frightening. Then I felt the bed pressed down as if somebody was climbing up on it. And then I felt what felt like someone kneeling on my chest. And then I felt hands on my throat. The hands on the throat is less common. I've had lots of other people describe it, but it's not as common as the pressure on the chest, the bed moving, and the footsteps. I thought I was being killed. It was horrible. And I had a feeling of revulsion and terror about this thing on my chest, not just because I thought it was killing me, but it just seemed horrible or evil was sort of the sensation I had. I struggled to move, and when I did move, it was gone. I leaped out of bed, turned on the light, nothing's there, but I was sure I'd been awake. And that is a fairly typical experience. The opening and closing of the door, very common. Hearing that even if the door was already open or even if the door was locked, with that sound of entry, very common. The footsteps are one of the most common features of this. And the footsteps are interesting to dwell on for just a moment, because they're not just any footsteps. There are a variety of footsteps that people will describe, but most of the footsteps are shuffling footsteps. They sound like, well, the Southeast Asians in their traditions about this say that the thing takes its shoes off before it comes in. Sounds like stocking feet. I had a patient in our hospital who had sleep paralysis while in traction in a hospital bed say that she heard what she thought must be several nurses with their shoes off coming in because it sounded like stocking feet on the wall-to-wall carpet in the hospital room. I have a Navajo example where the man said it sounded like someone in moccasins walking up the outside of the hogan. That's a traditional bark covered shelter. And he heard the footsteps go up the outside and then saw the thing look down through the smoke hole. That kind of shuffling, whooshy footstep is very, very common. I have a medieval Swedish account where the thing approaching the bed is said to be dragging a heavy cloth sack across the wooden floor. And the sound is made of shh. I've had that same sound described in Japanese accounts. The sounds all over the world are basically similar. There are other kinds of sounds, but that's the most common one. So again, that sort of constrained variation that is very puzzling.
What's an example of one attack on a normal, middle of the road, young American person?
Okay. Well, that's the one I gave you about me. I was a 20-year-old college sophomore in my off-campus apartment at the end of the semester. No strange practices, no odd beliefs. I was, in fact, at that point, I had grudgingly conceded that I guessed I had to be an atheist and a materialist because all my smart professors were, and they told me there wasn't any reason to think anything else. And so I'd sort of given up all of the beliefs and so forth of my childhood and reconciled myself to living in a purely naturalistic world. Now, the skeptic may say, aha, so you wanted something like this to happen. I didn't want something like that to happen.
Why?
Why did I not want it to happen? Because it was awful. It was terrifying. It was not good. It was, and what people I interview, other than knowing that they're not the only ones it ever happened to, the other thing they all want to know is, how can I keep it from happening?
Can you answer that question? You talked about sleep. One of the victims of this that we interviewed said several questions, one of which is, what does it do to your body? Mm-hmm. And apparently it doesn't do anything to your body once it's over. Right. So we can leave that one aside. What are things to do to avoid it and sleep? And end it also if there are tricks for ending it. To avoid it and end it, yes. Yeah, okay. So, common questions. What does it do to your body? Doesn't seem to do anything to your body that running up a flight of stairs wouldn't do. It makes your heart beat fast, makes you sweat. That's it. So it does nothing to your body. Ending it, most people, the intuitive response is to struggle to move, and as soon as you move anything, it's over. If that doesn't work, what people all over the world do, including modern North Americans who had not been told to do it, what they do is pray. And in almost all cases, people told me that as soon as it occurred to them to pray, it went away. Different prayers for different people, it depends on their religious background. In Japan, in the Pure Land Buddhist prayer, Amida Nembu Butsu, which is homage to the Buddha of eternal light, is the prayer that I've most often seen referenced for making this end.
I mentioned earlier that Mormons have a special blessing that's used for protection from evil, that I usually hear Mormons say they used it and it ended. So different religions, different prayers. In some traditions, there are specific prayers always used for this particular thing. But prayer usually seems to work. Not always. I have had some people tell me that they prayed and it still didn't stop. But that's unusual. Preventing it. Don't sleep on your back. It's not a good idea to sleep on your back anyway, orthopedically. And somewhere around 70-75% of, in my data, all sleep paralysis attacks happen when you're lying on your back. I have some ideas about why that might be, but I don't think we really know. But staying off your back is a good way to avoid it. Don't be sleep deprived, because the paralysis is linked to the rapid eye movement sleep mechanisms. If you're deprived of REM sleep, the more you're deprived of it, the harder REM sleep tries to express itself, if I could put it that way. So you get what's called a REM rebound. And if you're deprived enough of REM sleep, then you get a lot of REM right away on falling asleep, which is not where it would normally occur. That makes this much more likely. So get enough sleep. If you wake up from sleep paralysis during the night, don't go right back to sleep, because if you do, it's very likely to happen immediately again. Get up, just walk around a bit, have a glass of water, then go back to sleep. That makes it less likely to recur. REM is, in normal people's sleep cycles, REM starts to become more powerful after midnight. And it has a 24-hour rhythm. We call it a circadian rhythm. And it will become more and more powerful up into the mid-morning hours and then wane. So don't take naps in the morning, lying on your back, especially if you're REM deprived. But naps in the morning, naps seem to make it more likely than ordinary sleep. Sleeping in the morning, I'm talking about like 8, 9, 10 o'clock, seems to make it more likely. So avoiding that will greatly reduce the likelihood of it happening. And then all that I can say apart from that, anything that disturbs normal progress into and out of sleep makes it more likely. And beyond that, your tradition probably has something, anybody's tradition has something to do to keep evil away. Do that. You know?
So we can't say that it's supernatural, but invoking God makes it go away.
Oh, we can say that it's supernatural. Sure, we can.
Oh, we can.
and the skeptic would not probably find prayer as terminating the experience to be evidence anyway. They would probably see it as the other kind of evidence.
But a person with a strong religious faith may, if they see it being affected by invoking their God or their kind of prayer, may find that it must therefore be real if it reacts to religious experience.
And that's, again, a perfectly logical conclusion. I've talked to many, many people who said that their experience of this terrifying attack and their response to it strengthened some of their spiritual beliefs. And I'm not surprised.
We had every victim we've talked to so far said that it made them incredibly spiritual and diminished their current religious practice and faith because they weren't able to find solace in their church because there was no outlet, there was no word, there was no communication.
Yeah, usually if a person goes to a member of the clergy in any modern religious denomination and talks about this, the clergy person is going to be worried about, I better get this person some psychological help.
I'm going to interview a clergyman. Okay. We haven't got one yet, but we're asking.
Well, I have to tell you a funny thing about that. In my surveys, I always ask people if they have ever told anyone else, and if so, who, and then to tell me something about what happened. And one woman in a survey I did up in central Pennsylvania said that the only person she told was her priest. And when she told her priest, his response was, "Oh, I'm so glad that's happened to someone else." Because it had happened to him and he didn't know anything about it. And her asking him for help was helping him because he found out that he wasn't the only one, which is ironic because 300 years ago, any priest on earth would have known what it was and would have known what to tell people to do.
Hierarchical structure
Yeah.
dictates behavior of priests. Therefore, if it's not coming from the Vatican, for example, for Catholics, it's not going to come from the priest.
Yeah.
Unless you get someone who realizes that he has to act.
Yeah.
You know, in the best
With-
interest
with,
of his parishioners,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Well, actually, I've had a number, and this is not just on sleep paralysis, with the other experiences we've mentioned also, clergy who have said that as they, usually because of some kind of experience of their own, discovered that other people in their congregation had had experiences somehow related to what happened to them, and they knew there must be lots of others in the congregation who they don't know this about, and they feel, oh, I wish I could talk about this on Sunday from the pulpit, but I'd be in big trouble if I did, so I don't. Sad.
You understand that we can only see within a certain range of the visual spectrum, but there are certain sensors that can see on both
Sure.
ends, right? And it's just like seeing, except for the part of the definition of seeing, which by default defines the visible, right,
Sure.
spectrum. We also know that astronomists believe that 95% of the matter in the universe that is affecting the movement of the universe
Dark.
is invisible. They're calling it dark matter, not from my best understanding because they think it's in any way evil,
Right.
but because it's just invisible and it's not even dark because they can't see it at all. That had a huge effect on me because when I realized that despite all the laws of gravity and thermodynamics and all the laws of the universe that exist, 95% of the matter that they're trying to define those laws with is outside the realm of their ability to define it. It allowed me to imagine many things, one of which is that, you know, God could actually be in that part. There could be a big marionette just behind, right? He's
Yeah.
there and bigger than us. It sort of begs the question of the concept of other dimensions. And in a vibrational way that basically says, if we could, now this leads back to Descartes and the pineal gland, or pineal gland,
Yeah.
but how would you respond to a suggestion that if we were able to have an attenuated antenna or focus our perceptive abilities, that we would see that other dimensions aren't somewhere else, but that they're right here? I mean, that would be a real simple explanation for how come suddenly a creature appears
Yeah.
apparently
Sure.
from nowhere.
Well, people who have these experiences, not only sleep paralysis, but some of the others we've talked about, often say that their impression is that these things are always around, just that we can't be aware of them all the time. That's perfectly reasonable, and I think that's what many spiritual traditions say about the spiritual world, that it's right here, that it's, you know, that it doesn't take up space the way we take up space, and so it can be at least in the same location, if not the same space. That seems perfectly reasonable to me. Could we have some kind of apparatus that would allow us to see that regularly? Well, it seems that in some sense, those things must be or have a kind of energy. And if you had a receiver that was sensitive to that kind of energy, then it seems like you would be perceiving it. But you'd have to be careful as you work through these metaphors not to get the metaphors too mixed up. So the idea of a different dimension, domain, whatever, would suggest that it is a different place in the same place, sort of, as opposed to these being things that are, for example, you mentioned the narrow range of the visible spectra. Well, if there were something in your environment that had a color that was outside of our visual range and it stood in front of you, it wouldn't be invisible. It would just look black. You know, it would block out the light from behind, and it would reflect light that you couldn't see, so it would just look dark. So
Like a shadow, in fact.
it would look like a shadow.
It's very interesting.
That's a good point, isn't it? Yeah, well, maybe there's something to that.
And it's not a trick question, of course.
No.
It's, some scientists are very busy defining not only other dimensions, but where they might be. They're
Right.
trying to do that. And we've seen models of 26 dimensions and 9 dimensions and, attempts at visually displaying that.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be nice if we could, at least inspire some thinking in that direction?
It would. The thing that you have to be careful about is that where people theorizing about spiritual things and in a scientific way tend to gravitate toward are those portions, particularly of modern physics, that are least well understood. So quantum mechanics is always a really big favorite. Well, the advantage that has as an explanation is that quantum mechanics is deeply mysterious, hard to understand, and even the best scientists don't claim to fully understand it. What we're talking about, these experiences, are mysterious and hard to understand, and those who know the most about them are still puzzled by them. So that's something they have in common, but that's not a heck of a lot to hang your hat on. They're both extremely puzzling. And the risk is that when you start to theorize in those directions, you wind up with a sort of scientific music or poetry that doesn't actually specify anything in particular. It just gives an appearance of, well, at least we're speaking in science terms now. That might not be that big an advantage because at the end, when we're doing that, we still have to say, we don't understand what we're saying, though. Even things like quantum entanglement, which seems to give rise to the idea of action at a distance, there are within high-energy physics theories about those facets of quantum mechanics that don't sound at all spooky. They sound wildly strange, but they don't sound spooky. I don't know whether this is my gut instinct or what it is, my feeling is that if these things are the kind of reality they appear to be, some sort of what would traditionally be called a spiritual reality, that they are probably very, very discontinuous with the features of the material world that we're familiar with, and that obviously they interact with us in some way if they're real, but that there might be some aspects of what we already understand about the material world that could be appropriated to an understanding of these things, I think is a slender possibility. I think that you need to go much farther back to scratch, trying to get to understand this. And also, you won't make as many physicists upset.
Some of the people we've spoken with are sleep study specialists. They run sleep labs, several sleep labs actually.
Right.
And they say that these things last 15 seconds. They don't last eternities. They happen frequently, very frequently with children. So they wake up and they say, the victims, who are simply sleep studies patients, wake up with electrodes all over their body and they say, I had this horrible experience. The sleep study specialist is so good at it now that they can say, well, if I wake them up, they're going to remember a horrifying experience. If I don't wake them up, they won't remember it, but I'll let them have the experience. I can end it and they'll remember it, or I can let them have it and they'll forget it. So they're very good at this.
Yeah.
Well, they don't see any creatures.
I mean, they're subjects.
They watch the subjects on screens, they watch them through windows. The creature crawls up on their chest and sits on their chest and sucks the life out of them, and they wake up screaming and hollering that they had this terrifying experience, and the sleep lab says, there wasn't anything there.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I don't know what we would expect other than that. I mean, always you have to sort of say, well, let's take another viewpoint. From the viewpoint of the person having the experience, saying, but there really was something there, and saying, I have these experiences, I realize now, in this altered state of consciousness, because the altered state is what allows me to have these perceptions. That's the only state in which I can make this perceptual contact. Well, the sleep researchers are not in REM. They're standing there wide awake. And from the sleep researchers' point of view, well, if you have to be asleep to have an experience, or you have to be in REM to have an experience, then it's a dream. So what's the big deal? Of course, we've already talked about the problems of resolving the puzzles about this within the context of ordinary dreams. They're obviously not ordinary dreams. There's also, and on the duration of the experiences, their brevity as recorded in the sleep lab, there's always going to be, there are two big obstacles. One is the standard scientific obstacle about being able to be assured of the connections you want to make between your laboratory observations and what happens in the real world naturally occurring. And there are a number of things about sleep that we know happen more or less often in the lab than at home. That's one. The other is that because sleep paralysis with awareness not provoked by being brought out of a REM state into wakefulness by the researcher, but in the natural course of events, for most people is very infrequent. So being able to record those in ordinary nights, in a series of night sleeps, is very expensive. Outside of some narcoleptics who, because of their abnormal sleep architecture, particularly a tendency to have sleep onset REM, those are folks who are going to have lots of sleep paralysis. So narcoleptics are the ones who have been most often described. But narcoleptics aren't everybody, and they're having the experiences differently. So again, knowing is that the same thing that we see elsewhere is really hard to say. I'm confident that in some cases, when people think it went on a long time, that they're right. One reason that some people are pretty sure it went a long time is that they were watching a clock. And they could see the clock, and they knew when it started, and they knew when it ended. Now, of course, the clock could be hallucinated. The clock could be part of a dream, so they could be mistaken about it. But sometimes when people who sleep with people who have sleep paralysis frequently become aware that the other person's having a problem, it often is more than 15 seconds from when they started to hear them perhaps breathe hard or look over and see their eyes open. I think the 15-second rule is probably not firm. And I think that there are many questions that we need to ask about the relationship between the laboratory findings and the naturally occurring experiences. I think that it's very interesting and useful to look at them. I'm not at all denying that, and I don't want to dismiss the importance of the sleep laboratory findings. Most of what we know about sleep paralysis in a scientific sense comes from sleep laboratory work. That's how we know the mechanism of the paralysis. It's probably true that sleep researchers have gotten better at interviewing subjects about these things, but the things that I've seen passing for interviews in the past, they're not all the questions I'd have wanted to ask. This is the book that I wrote about sleep paralysis and terrifying presences. I published it in 1982. It includes an explanation of the neurophysiology of sleep paralysis, the explanations that have been offered for it in psychology and other sciences over the years, and gives many, many examples of people's experiences in different cultural settings where it was interpreted or understood as being a ghost or a demon or witchcraft. And I have found, and I've been told, that it is helpful to people who are trying to understand their own experiences.